All right, I think we should get started while everybody's still just getting the last of your coffees and cakes and everything. But I'm really, really thrilled to be able to introduce today's speaker on behalf of, obviously, SCAR, the Center for the Study of Narrative and Conflict Resolution, and on behalf of Sarah Cobb, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, to invite Dr. Winslade, who is our first scholar practitioner in residence, and he's going to be here for the next 2 weeks, hopefully visiting some of your classes, or if you're in the narrative seminar, there's going to be a bunch of events this week, and so hopefully each of you will have the opportunity to speak with Dr. Winslade and pick his brains about narrative and conflict resolution, which is part of our talk today is listening to conflict narratives. Dr. Winslade is the Associate Dean of the College of Education at California State University, San Bernardino, and a Professor of Counseling. And he brings with him an expertise in narrative approaches to conflict resolution with an emphasis on narrative mediation, narrative therapy, and multicultural counseling. He has been on the board of Conflict Resolution Quarterly and was a founding member of the board of the Journal of Conflictology. He is the co-author with Dr. Gerald Monk of 2 books on narrative mediation, A New Approach to Conflict Resolution, and Practicing Narrative Mediation, Loosening the Grip in Conflict. So we're really excited to have you here, Dr. Winslade, and just welcome.
Thank you, Alison. Greetings and thank you, and it's quite an honor to be the first person in that as a scholar practitioner here. I didn't realize that.
You're our first scholar practitioner in residence.
So I sort of feel an increase of pressure to do a good job in case they decide not to do it for anyone else. What I'm going to do is to talk not in a California accent because I'm very poor at it. So I'm going to use my New Zealand accent to talk because that's where I come from, and I'm much better at doing a New Zealand accent, and I hope people don't mind that. So I'm still, I used to work at the University of Waikato in New Zealand and still go back there regularly and have some part-time employment that I do there. And what I want to do is to talk to you about some of my interests in narrative conflict resolution work. My experience in that field comes out of several different things, and I think it's fair enough that I should tell you where it comes from. So I've done quite a bit of family mediation, family court work in New Zealand. We also did a lot of work with organisational disputes. We set up a centre and ran a lot of mediation type work in organisations, and I had some experience too in restorative practices, and particularly recently just published a book on conflict resolution in schools as well. So those have been the kind of places. I mean, I started off in getting interested in conflict resolution originally when I was a school counsellor, and people would come to me in a school and complain about somebody else, whether it was a parent or a teacher or a student or whatever, and it just seemed to me sensible to get people together and to work on whatever was the issue at that point, and that's kind of how I got interested in this field originally. And what I'm going to do is to, in some ways, comes a little bit from the influences of narrative therapy, and I've got a written speech that I'm going to actually kind of move to backwards and forwards to, and then depart from as we go along. So, because the reason I want to do that is because I have a few things that I've carefully phrased and want to be careful to stick to. Narrative frame always involves some kind of organisation of events. That's what distinguishes those words interchangeably. So it's organised into a sequence according to certain kinds of theme. These are just a few basic ideas that I'm sure you're familiar with. Next is the idea that there are always multiple narratives that can be formed of any conflict or of any life event or of anything that's going on in people's experience. Fortunately, multiple narratives make life complicated, but it's fortunate because that gives us more options and more possibilities for living. Any narrative is therefore selective. And conflict narratives are often quite narrow selections out of the range of possible stories that can be told. It includes, any narrative of a conflict includes some things and leaves some other things out. And conflict narratives often are going to select in certain kinds of characterizations of each other, of the people who are involved. Often a conflict narrative selects in characterizations of the other person as villainous, problematic, monstrous, evil, pathologically sick, or just annoying. And then the conflict narratives also select out some events and leave them out of the narrative. Things that fit with greater peace, things that fit with cooperation or teamwork, things that fit with inclusion of the other person are often the pieces that get left out of a conflict-oriented narrative. So that's just a few basic assumptions, and on the back of those assumptions I want to talk about some practices. Mediators, and remember my theme was about listening to narratives. Mediators are often taught to practice careful listening. And what is usually being referred to are the skills of active listening and the practices of active listening. Especially, I'm sure this is not news to you. I'm sure you've come across the practices of paraphrasing and reflecting, communicating empathy, suspending judgment, and all of those kinds of things, right? What does active listening do? Well, I don't have any doubt that these skills are useful, that they have value. They now enable people to be recognized and acknowledged for the things that are important that they're saying. And they add richness to emotional experience when careful active listening takes place. I think they do something else for practitioners and mediators. They actually serve as a discipline that disciplines people to listen. Even if it doesn't have an effect on the person being listened to, it actually has an effect on the person doing it. It helps them to demonstrate their own sincerity and to eliminate any misunderstandings that they might develop otherwise. But there are also some problems with active listening, and I'm going to speak here now from a perspective which I'm referring to as a constructionist perspective. When I say problems, I'm not saying that active listening is bad or wrong. It's just that there are aspects of it that are problematic, that I think need some attention paid to them. One of them is the focus on the individual. Active listening tends to focus mostly on the individual and their emotional experience, and makes the individual the center of the universe, which of course has been a theme of humanistic psychology for quite a long time. And this individual is complete with their individual interests. Again, nothing unfamiliar to you, I'm sure. And what is occluded when we focus on the individual as having their own interests, or, Fisher and Urey talked about groups of people as being, how they should be thought of as individuals, right? They explicitly say that. So even when you've got a group, you think of them as individuals with interests. What's occluded is the acknowledgement of cultural forces. And of course, for the last 30 years or so, we've seen a much greater attention in a range of social sciences to the inclusion of recognition of cultural forces. If you go back to when active listening was developed, particularly the work of Carl Rogers, there was no recognition virtually in anything that Carl Rogers wrote until later in his career about culture. Everything was focused on the individual. If anything culture was talked about, if it ever was talked about, it was called the environment. And other humanistic psychologists said the same kind of thing. Family therapy, of course, extended that to the family environment, and then it's been extended further beyond that and other representations. What's also occluded is any kind of acknowledgement or of the focus of the individual excludes the acknowledgement of power relations. If we exclude culture, we also exclude the forces that happen between people which we might call power. So I think what I want to think about is that how to get beyond the simple practices of active listening. Because there is always a selection of what to focus on, good listening is not just a matter of process, as it has been often talked about, in that distinction between content and process. If we're going to select some things out of the stories that are being told to pay attention to, then we have to think about how to do listening in a way that makes useful selections and pays attention to the content of what gets selected, not just to the process of listening. So we can say then that it makes a difference just what we listen for rather than just how we might listen. It is therefore an axiom of narrative practice that there are multiple readings that can be made of any conflict, and it matters which ones we listen to. Obviously, the two parties involved in any kind of dispute, or more than two, will always have different stories to tell about what happened. So in some senses, mediators have always been listening to more than one story. But I want to give you some examples today of how to make use of the multiple narratives and to listen to multiple narratives. I'm going to start with an incident from a divorce mediation. Because while I said that that several individuals are going to come up with a different narrative each time to frame what's being spoken about, so we can also go to what one person says and see that even that account is going to contain within it different stories. As they talk, people can be often actively heard to rule out competing accounts and state their preferences for the narrative that they want a listener to attend to. For example, in this example here, in a divorce mediation, someone might say, "You may think what I'm saying when I talk about wanting the children to stay mostly with me sounds selfish, but actually I'm thinking of the children's best interests." It's not an uncommon kind of statement that happens in family mediation. If you listen to that carefully, what you hear is the speaker trying to forestall one possible reading, the story about selfishness, the theme of selfishness in one particular narrative, you're being selfish, you just want the children for your own sake, that kind of narrative, in favour of another one, the story with the theme of caring and caring for the children. I just want to note at first, at this moment, that there are at least two stories here. We might ask questions also about some of the background gendered nature of the particular story being told. In other words, there might be splits between different genders and how they would frame these stories. Let me ask you this. How many people, when you heard that statement, pictured a person speaking who was male? One. How many people pictured someone who was female? I rest my case. That doesn't mean that a male, you're wrong either, by the way. It means that it's possible for a male to say something like that, but it's often more commonly featured in the narratives that are gendered in the way that women might experience them. When I say that there are two stories at work here, I mean in the sense that Gilles Deleuze talks about lines of force. So let me divert for a minute and talk about these lines of force. Deleuze has a lovely expression, I think, when he talks about lines of force. And gendered narratives illustrate it. Gendered narratives run through the middle of a relationship and exert a force in a certain kind of direction. At a point where someone starts to speak, they may be picking up that narrative, using it and going with it for a certain period of time, and then it goes on after that in its own line and direction off into the future. And that's the sense in which I think narratives need to be thought of, as lines of force that are sometimes not, that people have not originated for themselves. I mean, the person saying this is not the first person to say it. In that sense, there is a line of force running through that person's experience very often. So individuals do not originate these lines of force, but they might be carried along by them, and they at times can bend them into particular directions of their own origination. Deleuze called those lines of flight that head off in a different direction. Lines of flight are achieved by bending a line of force, he said. The practices of active listening tend to invite mediators to select one story for reflection and to paraphrase. But more sophisticated listening invites us to listen for and respond to multiple stories, at least the two that I mentioned here, if not more. Careful listening can always discern, I believe, the presence of other stories hidden in the midst of what a person tells. So, in the latter years of his career, Michael White developed a name for this kind of listening, and I think it's quite a useful name, and I've been trying over the last little while to explore the possibilities of what he called double listening. Double listening means listening at the same time to a presentation and a phone call. Thank you for that perfect example. Right?
I did on purpose.
Yeah. Double listening means listening at the same time for expressions of a conflict story and for elements of other stories, particularly for what might become possible as a counter story to a conflict story. So what does it mean listening for, if we're going to do double listening? First of all, it involves listening for both the story that has become dominant and for other possible stories that sit alongside or behind or underneath or around the corner from a dominant story. It also involves listening for points of bifurcation. Bifurcation is like a fork in the road where you've got two choices about which way to go. You know how a road reaches a Y intersection of some kind. So points of bifurcation where different stories part company or where the lines of force can be bent. I want to advocate here not just process-oriented active listening, but also content-oriented listening to just what story is being selected out for emphasis and what other stories get relegated to the background. The assumption of double listening is that often recuperating overlooked stories can make the story from which a person is operating less fixed, more complex, richer, more negotiable, and more open to another's perspective. So I want to now go on to outline a series of practical ways to do this. Practical points at which this kind of principle of double listening can be applied. And can help a mediator or conflict resolution practitioner to attend to the stories that might otherwise lay masked and subjugated. A common practice in conflict resolution is to, and this is actually outlined in some of the manuals, is to start by defining the problem. I'm sure you've heard of that idea. In mediation, the first aspect of the counter story is often this invitation to define the problem. But in doing double listening, I have come sometimes to try a different approach altogether. Rather than starting with defining the problem, which takes us initially into the conflict story or the problematic story, you can actually start by double listening before anybody has opened their mouths. One of the ways in which I believe this is relevant is people have come to be part of some kind of conflict resolution process because they're fully aware of some difficulty or some conflict that they've brought along and they've got rehearsed and they're ready to speak about. On the other hand, so that conflict story is very much in their minds. On the other hand, they're present in the room. They haven't given in to the conflict story completely and surrendered to its force and its power to the extent that they didn't choose to come, to be part of the process. And what I think that indicates is they have some reason for being there. Usually some sense of hope for something different. And so before anyone has opened their mouth, I sometimes want to start by asking people about the counter story that is represented in the sense of hope that brought them along. Right? So I might say something like this. My guess is that when you came here today, you had some sense of hope about what kind of conversation we might have and what it might lead to. I wonder whether you could start by speaking to that. Notice here I'm not asking people to centre their speaking in what they want. If you ask that, what you get is the Fisher and Urey position talk they're going to start with. Nor am I asking about their underlying interests, although some people may start to answer in either of those ways. Asking for people's hopes involves eliciting something bigger than their personal desires, or what they personally want to get out of the conflict resolution. It calls forth, in a sense, if people join with it, they don't always, if they join with it, sometimes their best self and their most generous and inclusive voice. So someone might say something like this sometimes: my hope is that we can have a civil conversation about our children. I'm sick of just arguing about them. We need to talk things through before it gets worse, and we need your help to do so. That's what I mean by a statement of hope. It has within it, of course, reference to the conflict story, but it has a reference to another story which is about hope. For a different relational story, about talking things through, for example. The counter story is even given a name. It's called civil conversation. From the point of view of this counter story, the speaker is sick of arguing. Presumably within the conflict story, arguing would be understood as just what is. It's usually or often surrounded with an aura of inevitability. Double listening requires us to hear two stories here. We can surely explore what the argument's about, and any kind of conflict resolution process needs to do that. So I'm not trying to occlude that possibility. But it might also be important to dwell for a moment on the exploration of the counter story. For example, I might ask, is that important to you as well? Sorry, wait a minute, I've missed one. No, sorry, I haven't got that on the slide. I'm interested in your hope for something different, for a civil conversation, for talking it through. Help me understand why that's important to you. Well, it's important for the children that they don't just see us fighting. They've seen enough of that, and it's been affecting them. They're both showing signs of insecurity, and we need to work together to make things as stable as possible for them. That's, I think, a parent speaking in their best self, still making reference to the problem story about the conflict and the arguments, but speaking into a different story of hope. At which point I might follow up with this statement and turn to the other party and say, is that important to you as well? Or do you have some other hopes for what we might do here today? Second person might answer something like this. In fact, this is drawn from, it's slightly condensed, slightly for the slide purposes, but from an actual mediation. I don't want the children to suffer either. Of course I don't. The tone, and of course I don't, represents a little bit of the touch of conflict and heat that comes out of the conflict story, right? I came here hoping we could sort out some arrangements so he didn't have to slug it out in court. It's so demeaning and also so expensive. We can do better than that. Again, reference to the conflict story, the slugging it out in court, the demeaning, the expense, the negative story that would get worse and worse and worse. And on the other hand, that we can do better than that. We can sort out some arrangements. So I might ask, the next question. What would doing better than that look like from your point of view? And the person might answer something like, it would mean being honest with each other, sticking to what's best for the children, and not treating them as objects to have a tug of war over. People often have very clear ideas about this counter story if we ask them, and being fair and generous with each other. After such an exchange, a mediator has a sense of both the problem story that involves arguing, fighting, and tug of war, and a possible counter story that involves talking things through, holding a civil conversation, sorting out arrangements, being fair and generous. And over the next hour, sometimes you might find that the conversation slips back into the arguing story. At that point, the mediator can ask the parties a question like this. Does what you're saying now resemble more the fighting you said you were hoping to step out of? Or does it resemble the civil conversation that you were hoping for more of? In other words, inviting people continually to reach that point of bifurcation where they make a choice as to which kind of conversation or which kind of story they want to involve themselves in conversing about. Which would you prefer? Sometimes this happens within the same sentence. I've been talking so far about that sort of starting off place when people express non-verbally the two different stories. Often I find in verbal expressions, they too contain references to more than one story. Very often double listening opens up the complexity in a single sentence. One way to start to notice this is to listen for the word "but" in the middle of a sentence. It regularly, I believe, serves as a hinge around which two stories can swing. So I have this metaphor in my head of a hinge, and you've got these two stories going like that around it. I was angry at the time, but I calmed down later. Active listening often directs people, I think, to say something like, "So you're feeling angry, tell me what you're feeling angry about." And ignore the other story in there, which is equally, if not more, important. Tell me what you calmed down about. Tell me the thinking that went into the calming down, the actions that you took, the further reflections, the different meanings that emerged when you did that. And I find it easy to access that by using the word "but," by paying attention to the word "but" and looking and listening for the two stories that hang either side of it. There are other conjunctions as well, unless, despite, although, also indicate the same kind of idea. Here's another example. We're still arguing like we're married, but we need to discuss what is in Sam's best interest and not allow our personal issues to get in the way. First half of the sentence is the conflict story. After the word "but," you've got the implication of something different. Two possible scenarios are represented. Personal issues getting in the way, and the transition to collaborating parents is successfully negotiated. Double listening doesn't involve just choosing one of those stories. It doesn't involve, for example, just being positive and choosing the positive story. To me, it's important to listen to both and to contrast them. Another example, sometimes I have trouble, this time without the word "but," sometimes, although it's implied here, sometimes I have trouble accepting that he wants to work with me because of the things that have happened between us. A little bit more hidden there, but there is, on the one hand, a desire to accept something, the other person's goodwill, and on the other hand, the difficulty in doing so. I hear those as two different stories that both need to be explored. Double listening then hears the two stories, but neither one is more true than the other one. Both, in fact, the truth of them is not to do with kind of what they represent inside the person's heart, so much as in how people actually act upon them to make them come true. And I want to start with that assumption that the truth value of either accepting or not accepting lies in what the outcome is, rather than what the preceding essence inside someone's heart is. Listening for the "but" continued. Our relationship obviously didn't work, and we can't fix the differences. But we've also seen other families go through divorce, and the effect on their children is not something our daughter needs to experience in life. Once again, on one side of the word "but" is the story of frustration, which cannot be resolved. On the other side is the story of a desire not to let the divorce cause pain to children. One of the common principles of humanistic psychology has been an emphasis on integration. One of the dangers of integration is that it tries to bring disparate stories together and unite them. I actually think it's better to leave them separate. It's more rich and there's more possibility through leaving them separate. So I would argue against the idea of integrating these two stories. There's more value in leaving them as two separate competing stories, each with some line of force running through it. And invite parties to think about the ethical choice which is involved in making the decision about which story deserves to be nurtured and grown. Next I want to pass on, I've talked about non-verbal expressions and how we can double listen to those. We talked about sentences that contain two stories within them. I now want to argue for the idea of double listening when people make an emotional expression, because I think emotions can be listened to doubly as well. Active listening is often assumed that people's emotions are singular and definitive of what is in the heart of people. It sounds like you're feeling really angry about this. That's a single listening response. Double listening hears the situation as much more complex, routinely much more complex. If we start from the assumption that an emotional experience is not just an event in the heart of an individual, as some of humanistic psychology has suggested or implied, but it's also, any emotion is also an aspect of a relational exchange. This is the social constructionist or narrative perspective on emotions. If we do that, a range of different possibilities come into view. For example, an emotion might be considered not just an internal physiological event, but also as a performance before others with an intended effect. Any intention to influence others in this way might be considered a practice of power. In Foucault's terms, it is an action upon others' actions. That was his definition of power. Anything that is an action upon others' actions. Famous definition that he offered. Thinking of emotional expression as an act of power does not make it bad. Again, Foucault's emphasis on power not necessarily being a bad thing or a negative thing. We're all acting powerfully in this sense whenever we open our mouths and speak. And therefore there's no such thing as being completely powerless. Foucault suggests that we distinguish carefully, when we're talking about power, between ordinary everyday power relations and relations of domination, which is something different again. That's the kind of actions upon others' actions that freezes the exchange and makes very limited responses possible for another person. So, an expression of emotion might also be considered a response to a situation in the world. I am angry, not just in myself, but about something out there. And in that sense, it's always a judgment. It's a judgment on what's happening in the context in which someone's living. If I'm angry, then I'm not happy with what has been happening. And I judge it to be wrong, or unjust, or whatever. I also implicitly, and this is an important point, I implicitly want it to change. If I'm angry about it, I judge it to be wrong. I think it's a reasonable extension of the logic of that statement to say that I want it to be different. I want it to change. And I might at least have a half-formed idea about what I would prefer other than what is. That's different from what is. This is also true of other emotions. If I'm sad, go to the next slide. If I'm sad about something that I'm missing that once was. Right? Sadness is about the sense of lost or missing. So, on the one hand, there is that sense of missing. On the other hand, the sadness expresses a valuing of what was. And I can listen to it as on the one hand, emphasizing the loss, and on the other hand, emphasizing the valuing part of it. The positive valuing of what once was. And then we can follow the conversation through to ask people how they might recreate what once was. If I'm afraid, then I'm concerned about a possible eventuation that will not be pleasant, and at the same time, using double listening, a preference for what might feel safer. If I pay attention to emotional expressions in that way, I can ask two different questions. One is, what are you angry or sad or afraid of? And on the other hand, what would you prefer? What do you positively value? What would make you feel safer? Double listening responses, as Michael White argued for them, involve an exploration of what he called the absent but implicit. This is Michael White's interpretation of Derrida. The The absent but implicit involves turning the coin over and looking at the other side of what is implied by something that isn't actually made explicit, but it's there implicitly. For example, as I said, if I'm angry about something, if I turn the coin over, what's on the other side of that is what I might prefer. It flips the story over, and then and I find when I'm talking to people about what they're angry about, often if I listen for a little while, I need to pay attention to the story of the anger. But if I ask people to turn it over and say, and what would make a difference? What would be better than that? What were you hoping for? What would you prefer? Any of those kind of questions. Often the emotional expression shifts and changes at that moment, and we get a very different kind of, the beginning of a very different kind of story. Similarly, if the emotion is one of sadness, we can flip the story over and talk about what is absent, and therefore what you value and what the affection you used to hold for the person or the thing or the experience that is no longer there or no longer possible. In narrative therapy, we've used that principle to develop the practice of remembering conversations, which are about remembering, for example, someone who's died rather than just missing them, and taking the valuing of that person as something to be reincorporated and re-included back in ongoing living. If the emotion is one of fear, then there might be an absent but implicit preference for some actions that contribute to safety. If a person is feeling despair, there's an absent but implicit story of hope. I'm feeling despairing of something. Of what? What is it that I'm despairing of? If I am despairing of something, I must have had beforehand at least some sense of hope that that might be possible. Tell me what that is about and we get a different story. In other words, there's always some other side to the coin of emotional expression. Flipping the coin over produces often a different story. Yeah?
I just have a question.
Yeah, sure.
In terms of emotions, it seems that you're suggesting that they're relational, so there's always an object of your emotion. So if I'm angry in context, in relationship, it's situational, cultural, etc.
Right.
But is there ever just emotion? Like that
on its own?
Yes.
Inside myself? About myself?
Perhaps. I don't know, but just...
Can you describe a situation like that?
When you feel heaviness or sad, or you can identify it in relationship or the object of your feelings. Just the physiology of emotion.
Well, what you just described was not that the external reference point is not there, but you just couldn't identify it.
Or it's a thought. I mean, a thought can throw you into an emotion if you don't, like nothing happened, but you have a thought about something that may or may not happen that creates a feeling.
It's still an object.
I think
there is
emotions
always an
represent
object
our
of the
relationship with the world around us. They're our experience of that relationship. But I think we have come to think of them through the influence of humanistic thought as separate from our relationship with the world around us and simply an expression of the essence of our being. And I think that's actually, personally, I think that's a mistake. I think sometimes there are circumstances where it's hard to connect them and it's hard to identify what the experience is. But even if it is with myself, if I'm angry with myself or sad about myself or something like that, or afraid of what I might do, then I'm still in some sense in relationship with a person, which is in this case me. Leave you to think about that. Double listening also can alert mediators or conflict resolution practitioners to the presence of exceptions. Exceptions to the dominance of a conflict story. Such exceptions often exist or may exist in a number of places if we train ourselves to be alert to them. For example, people often find conflict painful and they create pathways of escape. What Deleuze talked about as lines of flight again. They do things like they stop fighting and they withdraw, at least temporarily. They refuse to allow matters to escalate further. That's an action against the escalation of a conflict. They establish a truce, which has implicit within it the sense that the conflict should not get worse, that kind of judgment. They implicitly agree to skirt around the touchy issues. Each of these conveys some sense of a different story, or a possible different story. They opt for little breaks of calmness in between conflictual exchanges. These are potentially not just gaps in a conflict story, but also openings to a different narrative. And we can inquire into their significance with questions like this. How come it was important to you to not allow things escalate further? What we get in response to a question like that is an elaboration of a counter story, or the beginnings of one. Does it suggest how you would like to change the direction of where things have been heading? That question invites the elaboration slightly further. Does it indicate what you value and don't want to see damaged any further? Yeah, I value peace. I find conflict awful. I don't like it. I don't enjoy it. I would prefer something else. So in the middle of intense arguments, you were able to set things aside and concentrate on ensuring your daughter had a memorable birthday. How did you manage that? The ability to set things aside indicates a desire not to have the daughter affected by the parental conflict. It's an indication of a counter story, again buried within the middle of an experience. I can just relay a little aside here, a story I had experience of once. There was a couple I was working with who were involved in an intense custody dispute over two young children. And they just happened to drop into the conversation along the way that one of their children a few weeks before had been ill and ended up in hospital for 2 weeks. And for 2 weeks while the child was in hospital, they completely dropped the argument. And instead what they did was arrange a roster where one parent would be with one child and the other parent would be with the other child. And they arranged with phone calls and various things to actually work together to kind of make this roster work. They discussed the needs of their children on the phone, and they called it teamwork. When the child got better and got out of hospital, they completely dropped the teamwork and went back to the argument. And the interesting thing was, when they were telling me about this, they gave it to me as a little moment, an aside in the middle of the argument. And I said to them, hey, wait a minute, I'd like to know more about how you did that teamwork. And they actually said to me at this moment, why do you want to know that? It's not important. They actually said that. And my response was, well, I'm interested in it because I wonder whether there might be some significance in what you did as teamwork in that circumstance that might be helpful if we're to think about how you might do teamwork in the future. In other words, can we treat this exception as an opening to a counter story of how you might work together with your children? This is another example of using double listening, listening for those little moments of exception that get put into the middle of a conversation. Here's another example of exception to a dominant story. Someone says, look, I'm willing to accept that the old agreement is no longer going to work. That's a concession, right? Within myself, I've come to that place, with some reservations still. That statement, this comes from an actual mediation too. That with some reservations still expresses the pull of the counter story, of the dominant story, the conflict story. But anyway, I'm willing to start now to work on something new, some new basis for going forward. That's a significant move towards a counter story of resolution. The speaker is withdrawing commitment to the conflict, hearing the pull of the old story, but making a movement towards the opening of a new story. And the mediator's task, I believe, at that point is to capitalize on it, first by clarifying it and then by asking the other person to make meaning of it. So one way to create a double story, or to do double listening, in other words, is to invite one party to comment on the significance of a move that the other party has made. So I turn to the other party and say, what difference does it make to hear him say that? Party B: it's positive, although I'm not sure how much I can trust it. The word although indicates a double story, two stories. It's possible on one hand, not sure how much I can trust it on the other hand, two stories. So you still have reservations too. So I acknowledge the conflict story, but at this point I want to protect this new possible counter story by not going too far into that conflict story because it had already been expressed. But despite those, you hear what he said as positive. Yes. So if what he says could be trusted, put a bracket around it, what might you be able to offer in return? Well, I could begin to work on a new plan too. So we've now got that move of the second person towards a resolution story. Double listening enables the conflict story to be acknowledged in the sense of reservation that both parties speak about, but also a counter story of willingness to generate a new plan. The mediator often has to, I believe, assist in the opening of this counter story by shielding a fragile counter story for a little bit. Shielding it by not allowing the conversation to divert itself back into the conflict story when it's already been well expressed. Because sometimes dominant conflict stories can squash a new story before it starts. Here's another opening to double listening, for double listening. Double listening to managing or coping. Sometimes double listening can be used to render significant the temporary cessation of hostility, or the ability to carry on living in the face of conflict, or in spite of the strong effects that it's having. It can involve hearing the difference between a story that is stalled at the point of an intention. Sorry, actually that's the next slide. Before I go onto that one, just notice these questions. How bad has it got? The questions on the left-hand side are all about the problem story, the conflict story. How bad has it got? How did the argument start? What effect has it had on you? On the other hand, we can open up the counter story by asking questions like, how have you prevented it from getting worse? Often people can't see a way through, but they can acknowledge that they haven't let it get any worse. How have they done that opens up the possibility of another story. How come it was important to you not to allow things to escalate further? Does it suggest how you would like to change the direction of where things have been heading? That question is similar to one we looked at a minute ago. Double listening to intentions. Sometimes one story is dominant in what someone's saying, but there is at least an intention to do something else or say something else. And it hasn't really developed very far other than being a vague thought in somebody's head. If we pay attention to it, you can actually ask about those things and grow a story out of them. I've been feeling bad about what I said last week, and I've been trying to get up the courage to apologise. But the arguments just keep getting in the way of doing that. I'm sure most of us can understand the principle of the grudging move towards making some kind of gesture of apology. You can ask the question of the story which is at the moment being overshadowed, so the arguments keep interfering with that other intention. But if that interference were not happening, I'm acknowledging the conflict story, what sort of apology might you want to offer? And the word might is a useful word because it's subjunctive. The subjunctive is the world of as if. It's not yet real, it's just a possibility. It's not yet actual, actually. It's real, actually, but it's not actualized. Sometimes the practice of double listening means granting space to the voice of an actual other person. This voice might be expressed in the words of someone who's influential, someone who's in the room, but it can also be used to express the voice of someone who can't speak, who isn't there. And at this point I refer to the Deleuze and Guattari's claim that what is virtual is no less real than what is actual. They claim that virtual realities are real. They have real effects. They have reality about them. But they may not always be fully actualized. I think that's quite a nice idea. And here's an illustration of it. A virtual voice can exert a powerful real force that double listening hears as an opening to a different narrative. This is actually from a conflict coaching story, an example, an actual conversation again. Adriana is speaking about a telephone conflict with an agency from which she rents her home. As she talks on the phone, she's holding her baby in her arms. Adriana: I was very angry with how this person was speaking to me, but I was also aware that I had my daughter in my arms, and I didn't want to upset her. So you didn't want to frighten your daughter. What message did you want your daughter to receive in this context? I was concerned about how she might be affected by hearing me get angry. I didn't want her to feel the brunt of my anger at someone else. She wouldn't necessarily be able to distinguish that I was not upset with her. So, is this right that you were relating to the person from the property management office and being a parent at the same time? Two possible stories in that sense. Yes, I was torn in two directions in that moment. If we can imagine that in future your daughter might be able to speak to what she was learning from you in this moment, what might she say? This is inviting out the virtual voice of her daughter, who obviously at this moment can't speak for herself. But her mother is invited to ventriloquize her speaking, if you like, or her other story. And hence we can be double listening. Adriana replies that I was supporting her, that I was upset with someone else, that I was protecting her from being affected by it. As you reflect on what happened, how would you describe how you handled yourself as a result in that phone call? Well, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. I was relatively pleased with how I handled myself. I stayed calm and respectful, and I stood my ground, and I got him to listen to me. So is it fair to say that your daughter's voice, even though it was an imagined voice in your head, helped you to respond to the caller in a way that you feel pleased about, and to avoid getting angry in a way that you would not afterwards have felt so happy with? Yes, that's right, when I think about it. When I think about it, suggests that this is a thought that is growing in her mind as she's articulating it and I'm responding to it. It's often useful in double listening to characterize the two narratives as competing voices in people's heads. It's often a useful way to talk about it. Being torn in two directions is not treated, by the way, here as a pathology, something to be cured. Nor is it an obstacle to the true expression of feelings, so that we might aim to get to the point where someone has one feeling that they have, or one story that they're telling. Instead, it's a resource to be drawn upon. Multiple stories give us choices, and in this case, enable Adriana to make a choice of response in a conflict situation that she ends up feeling happy with. To honour this possibility, it is necessary to be double listening. What is produced for Adriana out of this is a sense of agency in this situation, rather than a sense of being a victim with few choices but to suffer. Now I want to go on now to talk about another narrative practice that's useful in conflict resolution that some of you may be familiar with. The practice of building and externalizing conversation. And let me start with a story. In this case, it's a workplace conflict. The mediator starts by asking this. And this is in the middle of a conversation, not at the beginning of it. So does that way of talking work for you both? Asked the mediator, taking care not to sound sarcastic and patronising. There was a pause in which the parties appeared nonplussed and were uncertain how to respond. The question took them out of the detail of an argument and invited them to soar above their own conversation. In the pause, the mediator continued. I'm just curious, you see, whether that way of talking is getting any closer to the kind of teamwork that you both agreed that we're here to build. Is it allowing you to go in that direction? This is on the basis that they've already said that they wanted to build teamwork. Right? Is it allowing you to go in that direction or not? With a little shamefaced embarrassment, both parties agreed that they were not getting anywhere by shouting and blaming each other. Well, does it suit you both as individuals then? Like, is it part of your preferred style of relationship? There was slightly quicker agreement this time that it was not. So I'm wondering two things, says the mediator. The first is how that way of talking took over from what seems for both of you to be your better judgment. How did you let it do that to you? Silence. And the second thing I wonder, said the mediator, is what effect it's having. Like, it sounds like that way of talking... Sorry, let me go to this. It sounds like that way of talking gets you both heated and your voices start to raise. What would you say it is doing to you both? And this can sometimes take a little bit of coaxing and sometimes asking the same question several different ways. But eventually, in this case, Bernice and Juan, the two colleagues who were embroiled in the argument, were able to acknowledge what that way of talking was doing to them. I hate it, said Bernice. It makes me nervous of Juan, and I start to get a headache, and I just can't concentrate on getting my work done. I feel embarrassed that you see me getting down to that level, said Juan. In fact, I feel embarrassed anyway that we're in this situation. It's like I'm a leper around the office. Everyone tries to keep their distance at the moment. So what would you each prefer other than the shouting or blaming? This question they found easier to answer. Well, I'd like us to have a calmer conversation, actually, said Juan. One in which we can talk about what we need to figure out in order to be able to work together. The mediator was ready with another question. So how would a calmer conversation be different from that way of talking? Well, I guess it would involve sorting out what the differences have been and trying to reach a better understanding between us about those things, said Juan. Bernice had been listening pensively. So the mediator asked her, so what do you make of what Juan has just been saying? She was a little hesitant. I basically agree with what he said, but